Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Botsociety podcast, where we interview designers and developers and ask them questions about conversation design, creativity, and more. My name is Monica. I'm a product manager at Botsociety, and I will be your host today. For this first episode, we interviewed Lisa Takehana, game designer at Google. We asked Lisa about her creative process in designing voice-powered games for the Google Assistant. Enjoy. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first Botsociety webinar. My name is Monica, and I work in the product team at Botsociety. Today, we will be covering designing interactive games and experiences for the Google Assistant, and we have with us Lisa Takehana from game designer on the Google Assistant team.
Hi, I'm Lisa, and I've been working at Google for about the past 3 years, and I'm focusing on designing voice games on the Google Assistant platform.
Amazing. It's a pleasure to have you today, Lisa.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. Could you tell us more about your experience until now in the space?
Yeah, I've been primarily focusing on designing casual games for the past 10 years, and those are games focusing on families and a general audience. So I first started out working on massively multiplayer online games at Disney, and then as the industry shifted, I working on Facebook games, which was up and coming back at that time, and then the landscape shifted to mobile. So I've been designing kind of casual games, including like puzzle games on mobile. Now I am working at Google and focusing primarily on voice games.
What's something that surprised you since you started to work in this space, the voice space?
Having come from this conventional gaming background, working on mobile games and browser games, what's been really surprising is how quickly voice games have kind of made their identity in this space. So I started again about 3 years ago, and back then the Google Home hadn't even launched yet. Mm-hmm. And now I am seeing all these different communities that are really interested in voice games. So for example, I'll go to like the Game Developers Conference, and I'm seeing these big companies and also smaller independent developers who are interested in working in this space. And it's been really inspiring to see that developers are willing to work in kind of this experimental space and willing to design things that are outside of the box.
What's your design process for voice games, and how is it different from designing mobile games?
I think about the environment that players might be playing your game, and that really kind of determines how the players are going to be playing on those different devices. So with voice games, we know that products like the Google Home or the Google Nest Hub, which is the Google Assistant on the visual displays, people are primarily playing them at home and probably like in a communal space like a kitchen or a living room. And that's going to be really different than playing a game on mobile. So if you're playing a game on mobile, it's probably going to be single player. You're probably going to be playing it maybe when you're waiting in line or on your daily commute to work. And in those spaces, audio isn't really a great platform for that. But with the Google Home and the Google Assistant devices, it's really natural for you to use your voice. It's an audio voice-driven device. And if you're going to be kind of speaking out loud and have the speakers on, then you'll probably be inviting other people that are in your home to play with you in the communal spaces like the living room and the kitchens that I described. So for me personally, the device that I play on the most is the one that's in front of my kitchen sink, because I'm cleaning in the kitchen or if I'm washing the dishes for like 10 minutes, then it just makes it really easy and natural for me to interact with that device since it's right in front of me.
Right. I find myself doing a lot of the same things. So what are a few best practices one should keep in mind when designing for voice user interface platforms?
So I think it's important to think about how the game will be structured between you and the Google Assistant. What happens is your voice essentially becomes the game controller, and the voice assistant will become the narrator that drives this experience. And so you want to be thinking about how that game will fit within that conversational structure and how you can drive your game forward in that way. And so something that we've been thinking really hard about with the new Google Nest Hub, which is the Google Assistant with the visual display, is that it's really easy to fall back on relying on the visuals when really what makes this platform special is that it's voice and audio driven. And so what we end up doing is we play test a lot with our eyes closed to make sure that it's still an audio driven experience and not rely on the visual side of it as much, because then it becomes more like, let's say, like a mobile device where you're kind of primarily interacting with the visual display. And we want to make sure that the audio is still driving the experience and not the other way around.
Mm-hmm. So you've learned these best practices throughout your career, but where does your inspiration come from?
For me, the inspiration can really come from anywhere. I think as a game designer, it's really important to be curious and to have an open mind about different experiences. So I personally like to pick up a lot of different hobbies because I think the inspiration can really come from anywhere, and there's probably a game about anything that's out there. Mm-hmm. So if you're a baking or cooking enthusiast, you can build a game about that, or anything that's really out there. I also love to travel a lot, and I think traveling gives me a lot of perspective in terms of thinking about how, there's so many different types of people out there, mm-hmm. and I'm not just creating a game for myself. And I also think it's really great to feel that sense of surprise and curiosity, because I think it's a great way for me to stay motivated and kind of drive that creative energy. Another thing I'm really interested in is podcasts and books on psychology and economy, because I think those are the types of things that help you kind of think about what drives and motivates your players. It really kind of helps you think about what your players are doing and what is driving them within your game experience. And so you can apply those learnings and think about how your players might interact with your game.
Is there a soundtrack or album besides podcasts that helps you get into this creative mode?
Yeah, for me, I try to stay really hyper-focused. When I'm in this like creative kind of mindset, I really want to think about all the different things that go into the design, and I want to minimize the distractions. So what I end up doing is like listen to a lot of white noise or kind of ambient tracks. Personally, I love the outdoors, so I like to listen to a lot of like forest or jungle tracks. Yeah, and it's just like that ambience kind of helps filter any outside distractions.
Yeah. Do you think some of the voice for multimodal games we're seeing pop up are mature yet, or how much room do they have to grow?
I think there's still really a lot of potential. Again, so I started at Google 3 years ago, and the Google Home hadn't even launched. And just thinking about all of the different devices that have come out since then is really amazing to see. So again, the Google Nest Hub, which is the visual screen, the smart displays are something that we've seen, and we've had to design for this new platform and really had to adjust kind of the way we think about design for these voice technologies. And I think the game design on these voice technologies is really dependent on the technologies that are on these devices. And so as these technologies advance, so will the game design on these platforms. And so I think in that sense, I think there's infinite potential, and even some potential for maybe traditional gaming to seamlessly merge with voice technologies.
And that's very exciting, especially in a big company. So when working on a new game design, how important is cross-team collaboration?
I think it's essential. There's so many really amazing people who work at Google with so many diverse backgrounds, professional backgrounds. And, when I first started at Google, I didn't know anything about conversation design. So I really had to lean on the expertise of all these different people to kind of give me direction on what it means to build voice experiences. So when I built my first game, I had worked really closely with all these different people who had a lot more knowledge in that background than I did. But in that sense, I was able to kind of give insight from a game designer's perspective. And together we were able to kind of come up with guidelines and principles of how to build game experiences within this conversational design platform. And because it's a really new space, I think it's really also inspiring to work with all these people and think about how we can shape the conversation design and game design that fits within the voice technologies.
What can the audience study if they're interested in a career as a game designer? What's your background in?
So I think if you're looking to study in an academic background, there are universities that offer game design or interactive media classes. But I think any background really that merges art and technology is a way for you to get kickstarted in that career. Back when I was in school, those programs were pretty new or they weren't really widely offered. So I actually know people from all different types of backgrounds, including like writing and theater, for example. I think what's more important is that you play a lot of games and you think about them really critically. So when you play a game, you want to think about what makes this game really engaging, or why do you think a certain feature is in a game? You also might want to think about like some features that you would add or take out of a certain game. And that critical thinking process could really help you think about how you might design your own games.
So what are some of the things you consider when designing games? Are you more concerned about the game being playable, having a great user experience and journey, or more delighting the user and serving as entertainment?
So for me, something I think about when I'm designing a game is, how does the game make you feel? And I know a lot of times people think about a game as fun or not fun, but I think it could be a lot more than that. You know, games are a type of media, and if you were looking at other media like film or books, you wouldn't really think of like a film as fun or not fun. You know, you have all these different emotions that come from it. So with games, you can be really invested in a really emotional experience, which might not necessarily mean that it's delightful or entertained. I think what's really important is that players feel engaged and invested in the design that you built for them. So in that sense, you know, going back to what you mentioned about user experience, that's also really critical in a game as well. I think with user experience, people might think of it as either good or bad design, but really, I think it's a lot more than that. You know, like technical stability is something you think about in user experience design. You also might think about how easy it is for your players to understand your game. And if you don't have these things structured, then it's kind of a roadblock for players to really be able to engage in the design that you built for them. So to answer your question, like both, you know, the user experience design is really critical, but also thinking about how your players can be really invested either by delight or entertainment or some other emotion is, I think, really critical.
That's some great insights. And that's all from our questions. We've received a lot of questions from the community while signing up for the webinar. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions that the community has asked. So Otis asked about the impact that the landscape of user interfaces has on behaviors during games. So the question is, as the landscape of user interfaces evolves in augmented or even touchless environments, how do you plan and test towards unknown behaviors?
This is a really tricky question, but I think it's also part of a designer's job to think about all those different use cases. We think about like the intended user behavior of a game or an experience and essentially the path that we want players to take, ideally. And then we also think about all of the unintended paths that the players can take, and even think about some ways that the users can take advantage of those features and use them in poor ways. It's really hard to think about every single use case that a player might interact with your experience with. But I think part of it comes with experience and past experience, and thinking about like all of the different ways that users might be able to use that. And then just also discovery. Like, I think what's amazing is that players are really smart and really creative, and they're always going to come up with a crazy way to use your feature. And you probably may not be able to think ahead of that. And so I think it's a combination of using your past experience and also just learning along the way.
So Doug from Nintendo of America asks, how do we deal with the latency that the voice handling introduces?
I think that's one of the parameters that we've been working with. So maybe some people who aren't familiar with what the latency means, it's basically you talk to the Google Assistant or a voice assistant, and there's a moment of pause before it answers you. And so there's this back and forth. And the back and forth has a pretty long gap in between it, or it could be a little bit lengthy. And so how we designed around that is going back to one of the questions I answered earlier is how would you build a game that feels more like a conversation where you're going back and forth, which keeps you from building games that feel more twitchy. So like things that are more hand-eye coordination based or anything that's a little bit quicker response. That's just kind of the part of the type of game that you can build is this kind of like more relaxing conversation or something that feels like a little bit spaced out. For companies like Google, we're working on building out and ironing out that fluidity so that conversation feels more and more natural over time. And so I think it's something that's going to get more and more advanced so that users have more control when they're designing around this latency.
On a broader level, Kay from Indiana University asked, what do you think is the role of the games in people's lives, and how does that affect your decisions?
I think it depends on the types of games that you're playing. You know, we kind of talked about, would you build a game for entertainment, for example? And some people do want to play it that way, you know, like some people just want a really short casual experience and maybe they just want to interact 5 minutes at a time. We know that for casual users, they don't really want to be stressed out playing a game. So maybe not something that's super challenging or really penalizing when you lose. So you want to be thinking about like who those users are. And of course, there are games out there that are being used in more like institutions and even for research, like medicine. There are some games out there that are used for rehabilitation. And there's so many different purposes for how games can be used. And really, I think it just depends on what you want to get out of it as well. And you can try to look for those types of games and try to fill your needs.
Great. The next question is from Manoj Kumar from HCL Technologies. And it's, how can I prototype gaming interactions through voice user interfaces?
So we talked about how voice games are really a conversation between you as the player and the Google Assistant or the voice assistant. And if you're building this conversation, you can actually prototype by having someone stand in for the Google Assistant. So think about what kind of things that you might say and then how would the Google Assistant respond back to you and what that natural back and forth feels like. And then if you feel like you've designed something and it feels like the player might say something that you didn't account for, then those are some of the edge cases that you want to put into your design.
This question is from Jiu from Carnegie Mellon and Electronic Arts. How's a game designer's job different at Google versus other game studios?
Google is, of course, not a traditional gaming company and is not something I would consider, it's not a company I would consider part of the games industry. And so, to be honest, I struggled a bit when I first joined Google because I was so used to working in a really traditional game industry environment. But what's been really remarkable about working at Google is that there's so many people from so many different areas of expertise that I can lean on that's outside of gaming that could really provide a lot of insight. So going back to what I mentioned before about conversational designers and their willingness to be able to provide insights on how to design a voice game was really, really amazing and inspiring when I was coming up with those voice games. So I think it's just a matter of if you work in a traditional gaming company, then a lot of those resources and a lot of the people will be coming from similar backgrounds. But with Google, it's a lot more diverse and you can probably find someone in a very specific field you're looking for to help you design your game.
Are there any overlaps in product design and game design? This is a question from Siad from Ford.
Yes, I think that games are a type of product, so there's a lot of overlap. And game design is really designing players' experience, and product design is designing an experience for that product. And so if you treat a video game like a product, then you want to think about the things that you might think about in more orthodox product design. So I mentioned earlier about like the types of environments that players might be engaging in your game with. And you would think the same thing about like another product. Like let's say it's a chair. Like, what environment would this person be using this chair in? Or how long do you think this person will be sitting in this chair? And that would dictate like how comfortable that chair design would be. And so I think like it's really about having empathy for the user and just putting yourself in the shoes of that user or that player and thinking about how they might interact with your product. And so in that sense, I think video game design and product design that have a lot of overlap.
So Jenny asks, what are the biggest constraints for voice game design?
Something that we've been really trying to work on is something we call discoverability, which is, like how players will be able to find and access your game. When we first started designing, it was on a purely audio platform. There's no visuals, so it made it a little bit challenging for our players and users to really understand how to get to the games that we were designing. It's been a little bit less of a challenge now that we have the visual platforms, but being able to direct users to the games that you want them to play has been a little bit something we had to design around and something we are going to evolve with as this discoverability improves within Google and Actions on Google, which is the platform that the games are built on.
And as these interfaces become more popular and these devices become more popular, I'm sure that's going to keep improving.
Yeah.
So Kim from Furniture Choice asked, how can we avoid branches and conversations becoming too long and draggy, especially in game design?
Thinking about how a conversation can get long and draggy in real life is actually a good place to start. So think about what makes a conversation not very engaging with another person even. So maybe someone's just talking too long, or maybe they're kind of rambling, and maybe you're kind of becoming a little bit disengaged. You start thinking about something else. The same thing could happen when you're designing a conversational game as well. So if you want to avoid disengagement from your players, think about what is the perfect amount of time for the assistant to answer back, or how much back and forth should there be, or what is the last thing that you want the assistant to say before the user, the player engages back with you. So just some real life learnings about trying to make sure that people stay engaged in your conversation.
The next question ties in really well. So Alex from Giver asked, what makes interactive games successful? Do you have any examples of games that have done well or better than others?
So I think success is a really tricky thing to define, because as a game designer, I have a different interpretation for what success means. And if you work for a company, then the company will have a different interpretation of what success means. For some companies, it might be the revenue that you make from it, so how much money you make from the game. For some companies, it could be how many users are in your game. And then for some people who want to create this like deeply emotional experience that I described earlier, it could be, did you make your player cry, for example? So there's a lot of different ways to measure this as a company and as a developer as well. I think in this case, maybe it has to do with users. So you can measure it based on a lot of the tools that are available for you for that game. And same with revenue as well. But something I think about a lot in terms of success is community buzz around a game. So did someone bring up your game? Did they talk about it? Sometimes they'll go to like a conference and they'll be like, oh, you worked on that game. That game is really great. And to me, that feels very successful. Yeah. So I think it really depends on who you are.
The next question is from Norbert from Dialogmaler. And he's asking about how to solve the retention problem, which ties in with how to make a successful game.
Yeah, retention is definitely one of the measures that a lot of big companies and use to measure what they call success. So just to break down what retention is how often are your players likely to come back to your experience. And for your players to come back, you actually want to think about how you want to design the game so that players want to come back from the very beginning. I think it's more challenging when you build a game and then just think of it as like an afterthought. Okay, like how do we get people to come back? Because there are a lot of games out there that are just meant to be played in one shot, and then you finish it, and then you experience it, and you have a certain reaction or emotion to it, and then that's it. But if you want players to come back, so for example, like let's say a match 3 puzzle game, there are a lot of things that you can do to get players to come back, like daily bonuses if you want players to come back every day, or there might be some bonuses, other types of bonuses for players coming back a week later or a few days later. And you can integrate that as a part of your design. For voice games, what you can think about is how much are your players willing to spend time in your game kind of on a daily or a weekly basis, and then break up your game so that it's easy for people to experience that. So for example, if players are willing to come back to your game and experience your game for just a short amount of time, maybe you want shorter experiences that make it easier for players to come back and tie it into like a reward system for coming back every day.
Thanks for sharing all the knowledge that you've built throughout your career. To wrap up, do you have advice for people seeking to enter the game design field?
Yeah, no matter who you are, I think you have to be excited about games. And I've touched upon this a little bit earlier, but making sure you play games and then think about them really critically. And then the next step after that is try to design your own games. And you don't necessarily have to be an artist or a programmer in order for you to design games, because there's so many different types of games out there. Of course, board games are a type of game, and you can easily just take some index cards and maybe a poster board and some markers and design your own game that way. But the important thing is just to start somewhere and really be excited to work in this field.
Awesome. And there's a lot of great developer resources for game development that we can link on the webinar video. Thank you so much for sharing all of this insightful information with us today. And thank you for watching Botsociety's first webinar. Stay tuned for the next couple.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, it was great having you. That's it. We hope you liked it. You can find us at botsociety.io. Botsociety is a conversational design tool. With Botsociety, you can design voice and chatbot interactions in the same way that you design apps and websites with Sketch or Figma. We have a free plan. Check it out.